I'm just looking to the fourth rapporteur who is missing from the stage. It's Professor Angela Banai. I am very grateful to the organizers to help me to invite her. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your substantial contributions on the workshops. It was a really hard, interesting and challenging work, and I'm sure that we could have this opportunity to share all wonderful experiences with all the people. I'd like to invite for making the presentation the activities from the first workshop, Europe and the Teaching Professor, Professor Jon Torfi Jonasson. I'll be from University of Iceland. I'll be very happy to mention that I have been part of this group and I'm feeling that I'm belonging to the final product presented by Professor Jonasson. The floor is yours. Yes, if you like. We have 7-8 minutes in average for the presentation. Be so kind to keep in mind this time as a limit. Thank you very much.
So, do you hear me? Or yeah. Is it all right? Is it working? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah. All right. Thank you. We had this group about European teacher. There were 9 of us there, and we started the discussion about just introducing ourselves, see how we came from different directions, had different perspectives, and then we had the presentation by Michael Skratz on the issue. And I think what we found all of us very interesting, what he talked about from the last decade or few years, there were a number of lessons learned about European developments. And sometimes I felt the term lesson might be used, and sometimes issues, but there are at least 10 issues that came up. And he actually talked about all these issues, and there's no time, of course, to repeat that here, but the issues are, we felt, very European. And I thought it might actually, when you think about it, it might be interesting to have every representative for every European country to actually go through this list and say, now, to what extent did that fit with my experiences? And issue number 1 was about changing roles of teachers and trainers in a number of European countries. And then, of course, for all these, he discussed that in some detail. I'm not going into that. The lesson number 2, or issue number 2, is the impact of societal and demands on new policies and how that actually was changing a lot of things in our countries. Lesson number 3 centered about public authority, definition of teaching profile. What should teachers or trainers know and be able to do? And this is actually an issue also taken up in most countries. So this is lesson number 4. Is on the partnership between schools and teacher education institutions, and this is changing. Lesson number 5 is the requirement and the support for research-based teacher education and how that has changed a lot of things. Lesson number 6 is the question of public authority and control of acquisition of competencies. Who should be in control and in what sense should it be controlled? Lesson number 7, maintaining teacher education in higher education institutions. I mean, this is actually changing a lot in a number of countries, and that changes the situation in a number of ways. Lesson or issue number 8, limited capacity of teacher educators to ensure performance of competencies. This is also an issue that's quite common. Lesson number 9, promoting the participation of stakeholder policies in development. Well, this was also discussed a lot, how this was different in different countries, whether it's a or bottom-down process. Lesson or issue number 10, the relevance of monitoring and evaluation of policies. And as I say, he described how this was actually reflected in a number of issues, sub-issues in most European contexts. And then we had the reaction by Kovacs to this, István Kovacs from ELTE, and a number of points. I think perhaps what he came back to a number of times was the importance of the soft approach, the question of the importance of binding regulations, and he argued that these would on the whole not be very relevant or practical, and he actually argued for a softer approach where you have commitment and a dialogue that would be between stakeholders that would be more, it would work better. So he argued that binding regulations on the whole would probably not have a better effect. He also mentioned that there was an artificial distinction between trainers and teachers that came from Michael's presentation as well, and he suggested that distinction should not be made. So on the whole, that indirect approaches are better than binding rules. Now, in the discussion, there were a number of themes that came up, and I will just mention them and can't go into them in any detail. One was the issue of trust that came up repeatedly. To what extent could teachers or institutions be trusted, and in what sense should that be the case, and in what sense could it be the case? And I think the sentiment was in general that trust was to be would be of benefit, and in fact we should move towards trust as much as possible. But then the question came up, could teachers and institutions be trusted? And there were some doubts about that they could be left totally alone. But this is an issue that was discussed. And then there came up the question of course, in this discussion, which is about European teachers, there was a lot of questions about could we perhaps classify countries, in different, set them in different clusters, that they operate in different ways. And there was some discussion about this, and I think the sentiment was that it would be difficult because you would construct different clusters depending on the dimensions you used for clustering. So if you use one dimension, you would have one cluster. If you used another dimension, you would have another cluster. So that would not be properly possible to classify countries very clearly. And in that connection, cultures are very different in different countries, and they are probably the dimension that distinguishes most. But then they may impact on different dimensions differently. Now, then the question of competencies and standards, they came up in relation to this. To what extent did we need standards, and to what extent would they be relevant? And I think the sentiment was, yes, standards should probably be there, but then they would not. You would also have the professional judgment would also be very important. And then about the changes of institutions. Michael mentioned how the story of the institute in Innsbruck, how that was established, and he didn't use the term, but I thought the term the birthday strategy would work well when it was actually connected to his birthday, the establishment of the institution. I'm not sure whether that could be a European strategy, but it would be interesting. And there came up this question of teacher education versus initial teacher education versus continuous professional development, and I think people wanted to emphasize both. But and Kovacs mentioned that how long the initial training. I mean, the initial training of teachers starts when they are actually early in the primary school, and then goes on the inculturation, if you like, of teachers. And then it came up that, for instance, in Ireland, this question of attitudes of teachers is addressed directly right from the beginning. That, you know, you ask teachers teaching students what kind of ideas they have about their role as teachers. And then we had a discussion around the notion there was that actually teachers in different countries are basically the same. They're not different. The differences have been cultures and systems, but not the people involved. Then there came an interesting discussion about what kind of approach should be used in teaching, and we had the examples of problem-solving approach both from Hungary and from Ireland, and that was actually quite challenging because they suggested that we might have a totally different approach in all our education and not least teacher education. But if we had a problem-based approach, the question came, what would be the problems we would concentrate on in teacher education? And that was discussed briefly. And then we had the notion of the basics. What are the basics in teacher education? And if you have a problem-based approach, what would be the basic problems you would address? And it was mentioned that in the whole discussion there are a number of asymmetries between what we preach and what we do, and we should actually look at some of these asymmetries and see when we are actually consistent in our approaches with our rhetoric. It also came up towards the end that discourses like that, I mean discussions like that, are in fact important for all. That it is important for novices, for instance, to take part in a discussion, to get used to how things are discussed and how you use what vocabulary you use, and so you get initiated into discussion. So it is not only the content, but only the process of discussing that's quite important. That's a number of the points that came up. So I think I'm sure my colleagues would like to add, but they probably will not be given the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonasson. We really much appreciate this conclusion. If anybody from the room, from the audience, wants to add something? If not, I will kindly invite Professor Kay Livingston to making a short report about the workshop 2, the knowledge base of effective teaching and teacher education.
Okay? Yes. Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. I have this opportunity to give some feedback from our working group. There was 11 of us in total, and we had a presentation from Ursula Kamen and from Catherine Helen, who was our discussant. And what I've tried to do is to pick up some quotes from colleagues actually in different parts of the world to try and summarise and draw together the very rich conversation that we had around our group. And I think one of the first aspects that I want to draw attention to, and I borrow a quote from a colleague, David Scott, who really pointed out that decisions about knowledge have to rest on some conception of what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. So in terms of whether we're formulating our curriculum in schools for teachers to teach, or whether we're formulating our teacher education programs, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? And also, what does effective teaching actually look like? And those of us that are involved in these processes, do we actually have a preferred vision? And one of the things that we wanted to point out was this sense of the complexity of the world that we're all living in. And we talked about this yesterday in terms of the troubled waters. And again, just picking up on Lingard and McGregor, they said that what counts as the most valuable knowledge needed to negotiate the complexities of a rapidly globalizing world. So in terms of making decisions about knowledge, we have to think about the context. and it's necessary to determine what this knowledge is and how it's formed, and the notion of what is legitimate knowledge, because we make choices about what is in and what is out, and there's a number of different ways of knowing the world. And what Ursula talked about was a lot of questions that she posed for us as a group to think about. So what types of knowledge is necessary to acquire in order to be an effective teacher? What's the kind of knowledge base? And similarly, what types of knowledge is necessary to acquire to be an effective teacher, educator? And the realization that there's a range of different discourses, that notion of what's legitimate, very different discourses. And she pointed out that it is a social construction. You know, how we actually construct what knowledge is important, what knowledge matters, whether as a teacher or as a teacher educator. We've made choices about what is legitimate. And we then had a discussion about what is effective and what is not, and the kind of discussions that go around that word, effective. And again, Ursula drew on a piece of work actually that we had done in a review of literature in the University of Glasgow that Ian Mentor and a range of colleagues we worked on. And she reminded us of whether you see the world in terms of effective teaching is something that is politically driven. So if you're a politician that's worrying about the PISA scores, then you might see the world through making sure that the test results get better. If you're a reflective teacher, then you're seeing the world as really putting the emphasis on analysing your practice and trying to do that to the very best you possibly can. In terms of an inquiring teacher, that research stance where you're continually not just thinking about the practice you're doing at the moment, but what might be the next practice in terms of how you improve what you're doing. And that leads very nicely into this notion of the transformative teacher, where you're seeing yourself as someone who can change. It's not just about replicating the status quo. It's not just the knowledge of here and now, but how might you create new knowledge to transform teaching and learning in either school or in teacher education. So as I said, we then had some discussion around the group about why effective teacher, particularly contested if it's only measured by pupils' test scores. Are you an effective teacher because your pupils do well in exams? And we talked about other possibilities. You know, why not an innovative teacher that perhaps thinks about the creativity in the classroom? Or we heard some examples of a caring teacher. And obviously there's other ways that we might think of what makes for a good teacher. And we came back to, yet again, that we cannot ignore the complexity of teaching. Teachers' work is much more than about preparing pupils to sit exams. And I've just plucked these four from our curriculum in Scotland, but you can see that, you know, across the world there are different ideas about what a good teacher, an innovative teacher might look like. And then we actually thought, well, who do you ask in terms of what makes for good teaching and what makes for good teacher education? And we said, well, asking the pupils. And Catherine gave us an example of where they had asked the students. And it's actually amazing how responsible pupils and students are about really thinking about what makes for effective learning. Often the criticism is if you ask pupils then, you know, what they don't know, they won't be able to talk about. But often they're very reflective in talking about what makes for good learning. So asking the pupils. And in relation to what sort of teacher education matters, we came back again about talking to the teachers and how important this doctorate will be in talking to the teachers and investigating about what sort of teacher education matters. And then we came to the word expectations in terms of how knowledge is discussed around expectations. And we came back to this complexity of a teacher having to really negotiate these very, very different views Because as I've said, you've got a politician who's got one view about the knowledge that matters. The parents might have a completely different view. You know, we heard an example of a teacher really being concerned about their son or daughter being able to learn how to swim, for example. That much broader definition of what matters in learning. If you're an employer, if you're somebody who is preparing somebody for a job, what knowledge matters. So expectations of knowledge we discussed around the group. And then in the issues paper, it's quoted, Hanali Naemi talks about knowing what and knowing how. But I was making a plea to really think about it in a bit more depth, because although you could collapse some of these things into the two categories that Hanali talks about in terms of knowing what and knowing how, really understanding the who are our learners and what are their needs, and the very different contexts that they're learning in and that they're growing up in or they're working in if they're teachers. And then actually knowing when. The teacher as a professional has to make these decisions about the combinations of knowing what, knowing who, knowing how, and then the knowledge of self as a learner, and also as a teacher, and also as a human being, the different characteristics that teachers bring, whether they're enthusiastic or quiet or a little lacking in confidence about change, or whether they embrace change. Very different characteristics within the teaching force. And we talked about knowledge of research, in that, is it enabling teachers to access the research that's already there, so they have the language ability that we talked about yesterday, or is it about practitioner research, where they're really starting to look at action research within their own classrooms? And then the knowledge of teaching. Halfway through our discussion, we realised that learning was missing from the dialogue, and that learning perhaps wasn't foregrounded enough in the issues paper. So making that connection between learning as an outcome and then thinking about what's the relationship between learning and teaching. So how we make this these different sets of knowledge into knowledge in action. And then I'll just go to the last slide, which is thinking about the research studies. We then talked about what kind of research studies should be supported in the doctorate programme of teacher education. And again, Ursula, I think she had a number of questions, but I've picked up on two that she posed in particular. I think the middle one is a very interesting question, that word interesting. How should the effectiveness of the doctorate programme in teacher education be evaluated? Because so often we evaluate in the here and now. We ask our students to fill in questionnaires. But what's the impact of that? And again, we came back to what kinds of impacts are expected from the EDiTE programme. So I hope that summarises the discussion that our working group had. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Livingston. A very broad overview on the results of the working group. So thank you very much. Then it's time to go further to the group 3, the initial education and the professional development of teachers. Professor Luis Tinoca from University of Lisbon.
Can we have some help here? It seems to be stuck.
Okay. Here. Here.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'll try to report on some of the discussions and presentations that we had in our workshop, which was very very interesting and very participated, and with more things than I can report, but that's good. You can compliment me with a few things that I will say. Okay, so we were focused on these ideas of initial teacher training and professional development, and also, of course, with induction in the middle, connecting those two. The first idea that Georgetta brought to us was this idea of the changing scenarios that we're having in all of education in general, and in the way students learn and teachers learn, and how teacher education is being developed. In this very big idea from a passive standpoint, be it students or teachers towards a more active standpoint. And this idea that we need more research-based education where the teachers stop and reflect about what their activities are and how they learn and what their practices is. We can go back to the ideas of George Bernard Shaw when he says that activity is the way to learn, or Schulman that tells us that not only activity but the way we reflect upon those activities, that's what's really empowering. There's also this recognition that we need to bridge the gap between research and practice, and this is something that we further explored. And Georgetta mentioned that using graduate students who are mainly teachers, about 80% in the study that she presented to us, can be one way of doing that. The motivations that these graduate students that are teachers find when they come back to improve themselves can be intrinsic or extrinsic, and we had a discussion about the difference between those, and how they have very much intrinsic motivations in their reasons to come and look for more professional development. But we realized here that we are also working in contexts, as we can see from the Thales report, where we have a lot of demotivated teachers, just like Francesca pointed out in our discussion. And that this discouragement grows with age. We saw this in Georgetta's study, but we also know that most of the teachers that we have right now in Europe are in the 40 to 50-year-old bracket, so that can be a problem that we have to address. We also saw in Georgetta's study, but also in other studies that we have from Portugal and from other contexts, that the encouragement of teachers is very important and the recognition of their work is very important, but what they see is that they're discouraged by the feedback that they get when they get to the workplace. They're not recognized by their peers as an added value to the school context. And this is even more the case in Georgetta's studies for women than men. And also, we need to look for new sources to support change and innovation, and some of them that appeared in their cases was the social networks, universities, recent research, and the colleagues as a very important added value there. When we looked into the strategies to improve the link between theory and practice, something very interesting that surprised some of us was the value that they gave to publishing research, and to the research that has been published, and how that can be an important way to find this link between theory and practice. But also this very important recognition of the networks, be it social networks or just informal networks that the teachers have in their schools or in their contexts with research and practitioners that can be very empowering for them. Also, and this is something that we don't do enough, the engagement with mass media, and how teachers should be empowered to participate in this discourse. This is something that we don't do enough. In Portugal, this is something that we've been talking about lately, because many times we complain that we're not happy with how things are going, but we don't engage mass media enough to show and to present our own discourse and informed, and we let many times politicians that are not doing policy, research-based policy, but ideological-based policy lead the discourse. Okay, here Francesca pointed out a few interesting things too. The role of social networks for teacher professional development, the emergence of personal learning environments or personal learning networks, and she mentioned Twitter as one very powerful tool that teachers are using and teacher educators are using more and more. The role of universities to support innovation, and this goes along with what Monica presented yesterday when she talked in the panel, and the importance to rethink and reimagine the role of the university, and we have very, very recent things like the MOOCs or the virtual learning environments or the flipped classrooms, and how can we use those to empower teacher education. The importance of doing this practical theorizing, this bridge between practice and theory, and revisiting practice in the light of theory in a continuous circle. And action research can be a very powerful way of doing that, transforming the attitudes and the values of the teachers that we know are at the core of that onion model that Korthagen talks about. Or when Guskey talks about teacher change, he says that we need to empower the change in teachers' beliefs so that they can really change their practice. And case studies can also be a very effective way to do that. Some of the most effective methods that came out of Georgette's study were the practicum, the case studies, and the optional subjects that they can take throughout their course. That was very interesting too. But the practicum and the case studies, again, show us methods that are very much centered on the teacher's practice, on their context. And here there are other things that Francesca also mentioned, such as their research skills and what kinds of research should we use, what kinds of methodologies should we use. She very much emphasized the importance of action research and practice-based research. We also see Marilyn Crockett-Smith, for example, calling for a lot of design-based research, which is very much targeted at identifying problems in the field and then addressing those problems throughout research in an interactive model. There it goes, importance research for the field. This link between formal and non-formal context, this recognition that comes in many studies that the teachers or the teacher educates many times learn as much or even more in informal or non-formal context as they do in formal context. So we have to connect these two and recognize them and empower that too. And communities of practice seem to be one of the powerful ways of doing that. And that's one of the research ideas that's coming out on the EDiTE project too. And how to make the learning of the students relevant, important for their topic of research. Assessment was also something that came out in our discussion, and here the recognition of assessment not from a very prescriptive and controlling perspective, but mainly from a formative perspective, from a feedback of giving teachers ideas of how they can improve their practice. And the idea of peer assessment, which has been we have seen it more and more in the literature lately. She also presented us three main reflection points, the ideas of how can we promote research or an inquiry culture in teacher education so that they're empowered to go back to their context and research them and change them and learn from those. The idea of dealing with the dilemma of the relationship between professional practice instead of an isolated academia or where the universities do not go enough into the context. And the idea to facilitate the transfer of competences to the workplace. Then Malgorzata challenged us to try and answer the questions that are in the issues paper, and we tackled some of those. We were not enough to tackle all of them, but we tackled 4 of them. In the first one, the alignment between initial induction and CPD. Some ideas that we had were to come back with the role of research at the universities, and policy studies can be one of the ways of empowering that. We can go back and see how we can inform those. At the institutional level, we should have more links with practice and involve all stakeholders in curriculum development or in curriculum reform, and not only the universities by themselves. In the second one, the role of supporting induction. This is recognized as a key period that is often neglected in most contexts. And what do institutions gain and how do we train the mentors to do that is also an important issue here. On the fourth one, we had many ideas here. The institutional contexts are optimal for effective learning of teachers. I would emphasize maybe the last question that you had there. Is teacher education well placed within university or academic context? And this is something that we should also try and reflect, and EDiTE may be a way of doing that. And finally, when we looked at the small group that looked at the last one, the implications of shift to learning outcomes, here very much the integration and the transfer of knowledge, the valuing of practical experience, recognizing assessment as a powerful learning tool, assessment as part of a learning process, and one way to motivate the learning process itself. And center the learning process not only on the results, but on the process itself and valuing that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you so much. Really much appreciate how so substantial the work was in. Now, the last but not the least workshop was linking professional learning and the work of teachers. It's Angela Baniai from Edite University as rapporteur. Yeah. Okay. We need more time. Just a brief question, Luis. You have mentioned 6 ideas, and on the side was only 4. Probably 2 will remain for discussion after this. Yes.
We were not enough to tackle all 6 of them, so we focused on those 4.
4 of you, 2 of the public. Okay. Thank you so much.
Only notes
Okay.
from the workshops. Sorry, but I hope it will be understandable. Our workshop was about linking professionals' learning and the work of teachers. It was the fourth workshop. And we tried to find interconnections between theoretical and practical knowledge in teacher education, in a special focus on the roles of higher education and schools. The opening presentation was about discussion about how higher education and schools can work together. I cannot go. And we try to find the quality and effectiveness of teacher education in a lifelong learning and community perspective. I don't know how to go further in this note. Oh, I find it. Thanks. Sorry.
Just scroll down here.
It's a bit slowly. So, I just try to find we went through all the questions like good students. At the beginning, I'd like to say a couple of words about the opening presentation, because it was quite a smart, thoughtful presentation. It went from knowledge, the nature of knowledge, to the professional knowledge, and reached the nature of the professional knowledge of teacher education. And we were discussing about the knowledge for practice, in practice, and of practice in workplaces. And we had some discussion about the creating, sharing, and using knowledge in the teacher education in 3 different cases: in a Hungarian school, a special Hungarian school, a Japanese lesson study, and an average Finnish school, and they use different kind of learning organizations and learning processes. We discussed what was common in these 3 cases, that they speak with each other and they share knowledges, and they have some meetings which are planned before. We went through the examples of non-regular ways of learning, how they observe each other, preparing attender, and this kind of knowledge when they can get from working together and preparing something together, and they just learn each other's language, which is often the difficulties between theory and practice field. And then, sorry for it, I wasn't able to finish my presentation then. Then we mentioned we developed our own knowledge triangle in teacher education. So it works also for not only in the business field, but we have the research, practice, and education also in this work, research on teaching and learning, and we can use it as well. And the questions for discussion was what's the nature of knowledge that is relevant for effective teaching? And I summarized the whole discussion for 4 main questions. What is known about effective teaching? What we should know about it? And what do teachers know? Because we in universities haven't got much knowledge about the knowledge base they have in the practicum. What knowledge is essential for teaching? What we have to plan in a curriculum? What kind of process they need? And who produces knowledge about teaching? Who is the one who knows the knowledge base and who knows what kind of process we have to plan them? We argued the instrument assessing knowledge as inadequate in several ways. And sometimes we focus too much on declarative knowledge and a bit less on conceptual understanding. We haven't got a clue what will they understand about we are teaching. And we have to design our courses in a different way. And then the questions are about the reflective practitioner from Donald Schoen's book, and lots of our colleagues mentioned it, that how important for us to understand the ways he wrote about. And how can we produce relevant and good quality knowledge for the teacher practicum? What can be done with the discourse when we work together? How to improve the quality of cooperation between teachers, education and institutions? What kind of role school is developing teacher competencies? So, and the discussion reached also the Edite itself, that how can the process scratch the practice. It was a question about if a PhD student goes abroad in this program, will it be possible to spend half a year in a university without watching a real school? So it will not be possible. This is one of the main goals of these processes, I understand. And we mentioned the ethnographical component also, which have to be part of the learning program. And the other question was tutoring and mentoring system. These relations can be very strong. And we just mentioned one, the special teacher training, which is stick to the practice much more than the university teacher training. And in this part of the conversation came in our mind the problem-based learning, which is a special process working together with different kind of expertise and interprofessional learning. Where it's also very important to understand each other's knowledge base. How can we put together our experiences and to prepare or design courses together? And as Francesca also mentioned in the key presentation, it's how important to have implications from the fields, from the schools, and how can we put to our work when we are planning our courses in teacher education. And one answer was also that what can we do? We always thinking about this interconnections since 10 or more years. So we shall widening our repertoire of teaching. We should spend lots of time in schools and working together. This is the interprofessionalism. And what kind of institutional context would be optimal for teacher training processes? these different kind of knowledge, what kind of knowledge can be effective for initial teacher training education, and how can impress our continuous professional development. Special case, and lastly I'd like to mention the attitudes also, not only the planning and not only courses we are developing, but how can we differ or make changes in attitudes in teacher training. Then how can we support schools in this progress? How could universities support or other professional groups support the schools? And finally, the reflective learning came to our mind. How can we change the type of professional learning? And that was all, I think, what I wanted. No, the last one was maybe that maybe we should build a solid institutional bridges between these two worlds, academic and teacher training institutions, and schools and workplaces where teaching is practiced. Cooperation has never been an easy task, and it's particularly challenging when we have to compare the university thinking and the schools from the field.
Thank you very much, Angela. You could imagine how so complex was her talks. 11 pages, all in all, yeah, you have looked to the presentation, 11 pages of conclusions. That's wonderful for the EDiTE follow-up discussions. Thank you so much. Because after this conference will be just a short break for lunch, and then our work inside EDiTE as an internal part of this conference will go on. Of course, we try to take into account all conclusions. Thank you so much to all my colleagues, rapporteurs. Very interesting, challenging, and probably one of the most intensive work in 1 hour and a half. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for your work. If anybody from the audience is interested to add or to make another comment, if not, I will, if there are any. Thank you very much in this case.